begin with, the first 5 years of a child's life are very important, vital, especially for their social, emotional, and cognitive development in later life. And we know that the adverse effects and negative effects of when the things are not done in the best interests of the child. The young child needs love and attention. And without that, then their mental health is jeopardized for their whole life sometimes. But it also needs parenting without stress. And I think this is where the politics come in, that we have to be able to support not just the child, but the family itself, and form integrated services. The state has an obligation to provide integrated services for the parents and the child from conception onwards. One word that is not often used in educational discourse is the word joy. And the child's first years for both parents and themselves need to be joyful. I've just had an personal experience of that joy. Got a little granddaughter of 1 3/4, and she's just discovered how to climb stairs on all fours. And yesterday she was with me, and that's all she wanted to do, was to climb the stairs up and climb the stairs down. Simple action that we don't give second thoughts to, but for her, this discovery was so joyful. It was palpable. You could feel the joy this little child had in this constant repetition of going down, going up and going down. And I think that's our obligation, to make every child's life joyful. And every institution that works with children to embrace that joyfulness that is possible in young children when they aren't given adverse effects or calamities or disasters that take that away from them, which in a way is almost criminal if you think of their future development. So that's where I think the state and the political area plays a role in supporting families and children to fully experience that joy. And we're living at a time that is so turbulent and troubled, it's very difficult to do that. Inequality, mental health problems, social problems, climatic problems, conflict problems, they all invade the household and detract from that full experience of joy that children need in order to develop their full potential later in life. So, Mr. Berkles, we're very pleased that you are hosting this today for us, and thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much. It is my great pleasure to host this important event and exchange with you on the topic of trauma-informed approaches in guaranteeing the services for young children and their caregivers. We live in the times that are marked by several complex, intervening crises with immense economic and social consequences for children, their parents, and caregivers. Amidst a raging war in the Middle East, Ukraine, and across other conflict-affected areas in the world, far-reaching negative consequences of the pandemic, and the rising costs of living, there is also a looming climate crisis hanging over children's future and the possibilities to realize their potential. The crisis put at risk the mental health and well-being of entire generations of children, especially children from low-income families, which are 3 times more likely to face mental health problems than their peers. Throughout this mandate, several parliamentary committees and various platforms created by members of the European Parliament have been dealing with specific crises, some of them also touching upon child-centered approaches to tackling these crises. As a member of the Employment and Social Affairs Committee and the co-chair of the Child Rights Intergroup, I have put this topic at the core of my political and personal endeavors, in close cooperation also with your respective organizations and other civil society stakeholders. Addressing the effects of crisis and on the lives of children from a particular angle in an ad hoc manner, we were, however, lacking a holistic child-focused overview with concrete course and policy guidelines for coping with the existing and future crises that are putting a strain on children, their families, and carers. That is why the Ample Committee decided to draw up its own initiative report on reducing inequalities and promoting social inclusion in times of crisis for children and their families. I was honored to be involved in drafting of the report as the S&D shadow rapporteur and to build on the knowledge and the progressive outcome of Parliament's work on the strategic approach to care in the EU that I had the pleasure to lead together with Sirpa Pietikainen. The report on reducing inequalities and promoting social inclusion in times of crisis complements the resolution on the European Child Guarantee, adopted at the same plenary session, striking a very good balance between the calls for targeted measures for children and families in vulnerable situations and the universal measures that mitigate the negative economic and social effects of crisis, as well as universal policies preventing them. It calls on the Commission and the Member State to significantly increase and ensure sustainable and adequate public investment in policies that guarantee universal, inclusive and affordable high-quality public services, such as care, early childhood education and care, education, healthcare, social services, water and sanitation, as well as universal access to decent housing, energy, transport, food, cultural and leisure activities, easy and free access to green spaces. One of my key priorities was scaling up of investment and strengthening child protection systems and social welfare services, allowing for swift implementation of the Child Guarantee in the context of new crises and a growing number of children in need, starting with the urgent increase in funding of the Child Guarantee with a dedicated budget of at least 20 billion euros for the period 2021-2027. The increased investment on the one hand and exempting investments in the key policies for combating child poverty and social exclusion from the national spending cuts on the other are crucial for supporting children, families and caregivers in vulnerable situations through universal access to integrated care, as well as individualized and tailored social services and mental health and psychosocial support. In addition to the aforementioned key points of the resolution, Parliament underlined the importance of setting up, at all levels, mechanisms for meaningful, safe, and inclusive participation of children, families, carers, and civil society organizations. In order to bolster the trauma-informed approach to guaranteeing services for young children and their caregivers, there is an urgent need to redress the lack of direct political representation of children by making democratic representation continuously responsive to children's distinctive and traditional submerged views. More than 120 members of the European Parliament have signed the Intergroup initiative to create a fully fledged new European parliamentary special body to promote and protect children's rights, which would keep up to speed with the complex challenges children face and provide a forum for children's direct participation. Inclusive, effective, compassionate, and ethical support to children, families, and their carers must be rooted in European and national policies that reflect the same principles, starting with empowering and listening to the voices of children. I strongly believe that we are on a good path to reach a paradigm shift that does not treat children only as vulnerable individuals, but that puts them at the center and sees investing into children and enabling their direct participation in societal matters as an asset for our social progress and cohesion, economic prosperity and sustainable development. I look forward to hearing your views on the topic and working together with you towards making quality childhood a reality for all children, also and especially in the times of crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Breglitz. I will give the floor again to Christopher. You want to introduce the speaker?
Right. So we go on to Michaela, who's going to give the next presentation. Matthias, oh, sorry. Yeah, got it wrong. Sorry. Okay, Matthias, over to you.
Here.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for this introduction that really frames where we are in terms of the services that we need to develop in the European context for children. I was particularly impressed to hear that you're talking about the need for universal services in combination with specific targeted measures for those who are particularly vulnerable. I would like to present a bit of a big picture overview of the systemic conditions that surround the trauma-informed work that educators do on a day-to-day basis with children in formal and informal early childhood services, but they don't exist in a vacuum, they exist in a wider context. So let's talk about some of the matters of concern. There are probably, what's happening with the slides? Can I control my slides?
No,
Okay.
I think they need to control that. Yes. This
Okay, okay, let's start from here. Okay, so systemic conditions that support integrated and multi-sectoral work in early childhood. Just sort of as a bit of an opening remark, where are we now when we look at sort of the reality of early childhood services? We are out of 2 years, more than 2 years of a global COVID-19 pandemic. And what we've learned from the experiences in many countries is that the role of early childhood education and care is crucial as part of the critical infrastructure of any society. What we've seen is from the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, when early childhood services stop functioning, when they collapse, the repercussions are just immense, and many other things become questionable and dysfunct in our societies. We've been talking about this. People in the early childhood field know this and have been emphasizing this for many, many years. But the reality over COVID-19 really was that many countries, especially in Europe, had to learn this lesson very fast and the hard way. So let's build on that experience. The other thing that we learned during the COVID-19 crisis was that despite early childhood services being very different between countries in Europe, but also even more so in a global picture, very similar issues have emerged. And we're actually now really faced with early childhood as a matter of concern, as Bruno Latour once wrote, in both the global north and the global south. And it does raise, I suggest, very urgent questions about the future direction of policy, of practice, but also about research in our field, and especially questions of how to overcome the field's fragmentation and isolation. Next slide, please. 2 bits of analysis from 2 organizations that are not necessarily known for their trauma-informed approach to working with young children, but I think they're important nonetheless. The first quote on this slide is from a report published by the World Bank in 2020, again focusing on the pandemic experiences, stating that the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the deep inadequacies in the current system of childcare provision, including uneven access, poor quality, need for public finance, poor terms of employment of the workforce, and the overall vulnerability of the sector. And the second analysis comes from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, stating that there is a general sense of dysfunctionality and discontent around our social, economic, and political systems, which they state is also a response to the damage humankind is inflicting on the world's natural systems and thus inevitably upon itself. And it's important to state here that COVID-19, they say, has not created these inequities, but it has put them in the spotlight. Next slide, please. So the OECD goes on to tell us that there is an opportunity now to rethink these dysfunctional systems, but they say, and to make them more inclusive, more sustainable, more resilient, and more responsive. But importantly, this can only happen with the active participation of citizens, and I would include children here, in new forms of collective action at the local, national, and international level. Next slide, please. Where are we in terms of our multiple global crises in relation to young children? This is from a fairly recent report looking into the situation of early childhood services in New York City, warning us not in relation to global warming, rising sea levels. Up to 80% of childcare services in New York City are at risk of flooding, and they are exactly the services that cater for the most vulnerable populations. And concluding that we can no longer see childcare, climate change, pandemics, and others as separate issues. Next slide, please. So, are we facing a perfect storm of self-inflicted existential crisis, climate catastrophe, loss of biodiversity, pandemics, violence, war, forced migration at an unprecedented scale? They are connected and they mutually reinforce each other, and children are, as UNICEF reminds us, quite often and regularly as UNICEF says, the hidden victims of the crisis scenario. In that perfect storm, I think it is also important to acknowledge that the West, and I include Europe in this, is losing or actually has lost credibility to be the moral compass for the world. Think what's happening in terms of COP28, think what's happening in relation to Palestine and Gaza. We are facing a global reality that has thrown into the air all certainties, all our taken for granted distinctions between global south and global north. And this little picture on the side here shows that the coastlines of Bangladesh and New York are actually merging in that respect. So this is what we're facing on the globe, on a global scale. Next slide, please. And as Edgar Morin reminds us, and this is actually some years old already, but still I think is spot on when he says, what is the number one vital problem we're facing? And he says, one is at a loss to single out a number one problem to which all others would be subordinated. There is no single vital problem, but many vital problems. And it is this complex intersolidarity of problems, crises, uncontrolled processes, and the general crisis of the planet that constitutes the number one vital problem. So we are in a situation where it's not just children that are traumatized. We could actually say we live in a traumatized world, and young children and their families, they tend to be the victims of these crisis scenarios. But if children are traumatized, so are educators, and so are entire support systems around them. Siegfried Bernfeld, the Austrian psychoanalyst, many years ago, in 1925, says education. What is education? He offers a definition and says education is the sum total of the social reaction to the fact of ontogenetic postnatal development. Sum total of the social reaction. I think we need to urgently recalculate our sum total in terms of our education. Next slide, please. So we need to think about how to move on from our existing certainties, our paradigms. We are fast approaching the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. And I think we require some radical new thinking when it comes to how to approach services for young children. Mainstream debate in our field in early child education and care sometimes appears stuck in some kind of time loop. We're dealing with 20th century issues, and we seem unable to escape some of our taken for granted assumptions that are, for instance, about a very narrow Western-centric understanding of what it is to be a child and to develop the universal child, the individual child, as the center of attention rather than the child as part of a community. The assumption of that scientific knowledge, decontextualized knowledge, is superior to children's and families and communities' funds of knowledge, what they bring into our services. And of course, the assumption that we can, in a very simplistic way, measure and compare what's happening in countries, between countries, in services, between countries. But most worryingly, I suppose, and this brings us to the topic of integrated services, most worryingly, our certainties are reflected in our political administrative systems of governance. So think we're in the center of Europe, think directors general at EU level, think departments, ministries at country level. And we continue to rely on distinct policies and practices as tools for solving distinct social problems by distinct professions, distinct academic disciplines, and that is no longer sufficient. Next slide, please. The New York report points to some possible responses, and some of them you mentioned in your introduction. They say it's not just about building a flood barrier around the early childhood center. It is about improving neighborhoods from the ground up, support for developing new green anchor institutions that every family deserves access to, abundant affordable housing, quality early care and education programs, safe streets, engaging play spaces, accessible healthcare, diverse and sprawling cultural institutions, and the many other places and amenities that make a community feel like home. So this is sort of a compass, next slide please, that we need to bring into our thinking. The European Union is slowly beginning to adopt to a more integrated thinking about young children. This is from the Council conclusion 2019, saying that if we're serious about early childhood contributing to combating child poverty, for instance, then we have to acknowledge that early child education and care doesn't do it on itself. It has to be part of an integrated child's rights-based package of policy measures to improve outcomes for children. So there's an opening there in the policy environment, which I think is crucially important. But it's only an opening. We need to think further. The child guarantee is a further opening, but again, this is thinking that is only catching up with some of the developments we see in other parts of the world already. Next slide, please. So what we see, I'm not going to read all this, but this is just to sort of, because I think the slides might be shared afterwards. This is just to show that when we look globally, we have 76 countries already around the world that have introduced integrated early childhood development and early childhood education policy frameworks. Notably, most of these policy frameworks originate in the so-called Global South, in Asia, in parts of Africa, and most prominently in South America. I think we urgently need to learn with these regions and with these countries in terms of their experiences. Next slide, please. Because it is about bringing together all actors and all elements around children and their families and communities in what I call a competence system, which is about sharing knowledges, sharing practices, sharing values between all elements and layers of the system, from the practitioner that works with the children on a Tuesday morning in the setting, right through to what's happening in this room and what's happening in the university and elsewhere. Next slide, please. This is just one example of how this might look like. This is from a document developed in the context of the Republic of Colombia. Colombia has introduced one of the most ambitious early childhood policy frameworks in the world. And one of the interesting things about it is that they have actually introduced this simultaneously at various levels, at the national level, at the territorial or state level, and at the level of the local authorities. So this is just one example of a document how different strands of services operate together in one integrated framework at the level of one local authority. Next slide, please. Some key factors for success for such integrated systems, as we see again in the Colombian example. I could have brought others, but there are some key elements that I think are crucial for our learning, and here they are. One is that in the Colombian context, children's rights have been recognized in the Constitution very early on. Since 1991, children's rights have been enshrined in the national Constitution. There has been strategic leadership towards developing these policies at very high level. At the Office of the President of the Republic, an interdepartmental working group was established, chaired by the President of the Republic, which was given responsibility for policy development and implementation. They spent a lot of time organizing very broad buy-in from government departments, from other actors, from non-state actors. Crucially, Colombia gave this interdepartmental group an integrated budget, so they had resources to actually spend rather than compete for resources between different government departments and ministries. And as I said, they replicated this structure at the national, territorial, and municipal level, which is crucially important because policy priorities at national level can change, presidents change, but if things are established at the many different layers, it's very hard to undo them. And finally, and I think this is something that's quite often forgotten when we create very ambitious policy frameworks, they have to be enshrined into binding national legislation. We're going to skip 2 slides now. Next one, please. Next one, please. The 2 slides I skipped were a European example, and I'm not going to talk about this in any detail, but it is just to show what happens if you don't have these crucial points of securing the policy framework. It was the example of the UK Sure Start Children's Centres, who had a huge impact on improving outcomes for children and the lives of communities, but who are basically eroded because a lot of the things that the Colombians did in terms of securing them in legislation, securing funding, securing them in the national and local structure, that didn't happen. So as soon as policy priorities changed, things went belly up. Some developments that I think we need to take into account when we think about how to discuss and shape European policies that are taking place at the global stage at the moment. You might be familiar with some of those documents on this slide. The first one, of course, is the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal Framework. You might recognize that there is one goal in there, Goal 4, that talks about education. There is a target 4.2 that talks about early childhood and the aim to have access to high quality early childhood services for every girl and boy by 2030. But I think we also need to change that discourse. Instead of following only the agenda to see, can we achieve target 4.2, to argue very strongly that early childhood is the enabler, the key enabler for achieving the entire framework of all the goals. This is where you start. Low threshold services in the community. This is where we open the door to achieving the entire framework. The second document it's called the Abidjan Principles, which is an agreement by the signatory states and bodies to prioritize public education over private from birth, and to strongly regulate private involvement in education. And I think, again, this is something that is has to be part of a crucial of a framework when we talk about integrated multi-sectoral rights-based services. And thirdly, very recently, we're 1 year away from, after the Tashkent Declaration, November 22, UNESCO World Conference on Early Child Care and Education, adopting the Tashkent Declaration and Plan for Action that states education as a right for every child from birth. So we're not talking pre-primary, we have to talk about what's happening for the very youngest children. That states the importance of whole of government, multi-sectoral and integrated policy development, provision and coordination, and that urges countries to spend at least 10% of their overall education budget for the first years. We're going to skip this, and we're going to end with this, which is really a proposal for a high-level proposal for how we might move on our discussion at the European level. I think when we talk about the EU Child Guarantee, we urgently need some high-level leadership and coordination. There is a Secretary General in the European Commission, question mark. I think we urgently need a visible, a publicly visible interdepartmental, inter-directorate general working group, not just behind the scenes, because I know there's a lot of coordination happening behind the doors, but it's not visible, with a clear focus on young children from birth, their families and their communities. And I think there needs to be competence to child-proof and implement policies across the entire EU system. And I think what's also crucially important is to establish much more systematic links between the policy-making process and the administration, between Parliament and Commission, because that is where the policy proposals can take shape, but also where the first steps happen into implementation in member states. And is there one final slide? I think there is, yes, because I can't leave you without a quote from Paulo Freire, who wrote about all this many years ago in a text called Letters to Guinea-Bissau, where he says, radical transformation of the education system, that's the aim at the time. But he reminds us such a transformation is not a mechanical task. It can never be done mechanically. It's political. It requires a political decision that has to be coherent with an idea, with a vision, with a plan for society to be created. And it must be based on certain material conditions that offer incentives for change. So it's not just the utopian thinking. We need that. We need the vision. We need to understand that that is achieving integrated multi-sectoral services for all children and family is a political project. It's an ethical project, but it requires resources, material conditions, funding, time, resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthias. So we pass it on to Nikki. Thank you.
And good morning, everyone. And I'm really very pleased to speak after Matthias, and all the interventions in the morning actually have set a good ground for addressing another issue which is equally important when talking about trauma-informed approaches, because actually we are talking about the ones that are interacting directly with children and families. And that's from where we also have to start thinking how the system is really supporting them in working together, but also in feeling confident on how they can address, oops, that's a very interesting, I don't know how it looks on your computer, but here it looks very strange. Well, that doesn't look strange. This one, yes. The title actually of the presentation is like Early Childhood Professionals Can Make a Difference. And we know they can make a difference for many children and families, but what makes a difference for them? Because we have to also consider in a system that is trying hard to address the needs of all children. And we have heard efforts are put into that to create that kind of articulated system that is working towards quality, equity, inclusion. And there are many policies that have been issued at European level, at country level. The problem is something is not working. Somewhere the things are getting stuck. And it is a matter of coordination. It is a matter of having a culture of working together, but it's also a matter of having a culture that values the professionals working in these systems. And unfortunately, as we can see, the early childhood system actually is not yet very clearly articulated in all the countries. We talk about pieces of the system, but they don't see themselves as being part of an integrated system. I'm Mihaela Ionescu, representing the International Step-by-Step Association. And just briefly to say, if I'm speaking because of the experience of the members that are working in countries. There are 100 organizations that have been working in the early childhood field. As an organization, we have 25 years. So we have seen a lot happening in the field over the years. And I'm speaking on behalf of those that are working directly with professionals, and they have learned what are their issues, what their problems, what their challenges, and how urgent are some of the matters to be addressed. Next slide. And it has been mentioned, I think the fonts on my presentation are not fitting the setting of the computer. What is written is something that you cannot necessarily read. It's mentioning what has been said, the COVID, the economic crisis, the natural disasters, the war in Ukraine, all these past 4 years. We've noticed something by just listening to what is happening on the ground in countries. And one of the issues that we have noticed is that early childhood development is not prioritized in times of crisis. I mean, there are many issues that are popping up in societies, but early years are not necessarily one of the most important priority. And there's a low readiness of the early childhood system to adequately respond to those crises. It looks like they kind of froze, they try to react. It's a more of a reactive mode rather than a proactive mode. And there is a low capacity in services to counterbalance the negative effects of the trauma on child development and the well-being for children and for caregivers too. They are trying to cope with it. They're trying to find the best solutions, but they are not necessarily well equipped to respond. And in many cases, professionals felt overwhelmed. And we have heard everything that happened during the pandemic, but the same has happened in the countries where lots of refugees from Ukraine, with a very high influx actually of young children and mothers. Remember that there were primarily mothers with young children. Many of them, professionals have really tried their best. So why do we have to get into the situation that they have to invent themselves as heroes to save the lives of children and mothers? Because in many of the cases, they felt that way. They are professionals and they have the right to be well equipped. And I heard the word joy and I joyed about it, because that's what actually we are trying to bring also, not only to children and to parents, but also to professionals, because if they are not experiencing well-being, they will not be able to support the well-being of the others. Next slide. What the key points in responding to crisis situation has been that the child's well-being depends on the family well-being, and it has been said. It's the same microcosmos that is close to the child and is the most important one, gives them resilience, balance, and joy. But on the other hand, child and family well-being depend on the communities where they live and where they settle in the case of the refugees, and on the services that they found there. So, question mark, how well equipped are those services to create that kind of environment for them? And it is about a systemic way at the local level, which matters sometimes even more than the decisions that are taken at the national level, which are not always translated into realities at the local level. Next slide. What are some of the risks that we have noticed when in the reactive mode, and with many policies trying to be prompt and react to the unprecedented, I would say, situation that has happened with the world in Ukraine, where there have been other refugees coming to Europe, but not from a war in the heart of Europe. One of the risks was doing harm unintentionally, because professionals were not necessarily trained properly on how to react, on how to address, how to approach children and caregivers. There has been the risk of over pathologizing trauma, like everybody has a problem, and it's not necessarily the case. Or not preventing the negative effects of trauma on child development and well-being on their caregivers, as well as the staff burnout and overstress. I've been last week at the Education Summit, European Education Summit, and one of the problems was the shortage of teachers. And the shortage, we talked about the shortage of early childhood education and care professionals. Well, one of the factors is the stress, overstress and burnout, because there are so many things that they have to cope with that I have not been necessarily prepared to. And their working conditions are really dire in many of the situations. In situations of crisis, this is becoming acute, and that's the risk that you lose even more professionals. So how we can really prepare better the systems to react in that kind of situations, and that they don't feel alone, and they feel supported, and they feel part of a community that actually is well equipped to address it. And then we learned very quickly after the first weeks of war, actually, that there is a very high demand for capacity building of psychosocial support and trauma-informed interventions, and how to build resilience in children and caregivers. This has been, a really strong alarm coming from the organizations in our network, and we've tried to see what can we do. There is a lot of expertise lying in many of the services, in many organizations, but how well equipped they have been to mobilize themselves to articulate such a program that instantly supports professionals. And that's what we have tried to do from May 2020. We're starting, next slide. We organized the training of trainers. We put up a training for master trainers in countries so that they can further train as quickly as possible, as fast as possible. It's a foundational training just to give a hand to those that needed to cope with really very hard situation and trying to solve many of the problems that they have witnessed. Children that were in distress, families that were in distress, and them wanting to help everybody. The two key principles that we had in the training is do no harm, but also that this training is not a training in psychotherapy, because we have early childhood professionals that have their own preparation, and they have the tools and skills and knowledge that can be mobilized, but in an approach that gives more sensitivity to how you approach children in distress and families. Next slide. Just briefly to give you that's the title of the training, Foundational Training on Psychological Aid and Trauma-Informed Approaches. There were some building blocks, and what we wanted for them to, there were some key concepts, even what means psychological first aid, because we do know when a person is in a dire need of an accident, we do provide first aid, right? And we have been even trained to do that in our schools, but nobody gives any indication of what is psychological first aid. And that's something that it's basic, and it's something that it should not be very difficult to be understood by many of the professionals interacting with children and families. And we have to have, what are those guiding principles? They're basic, but they are so important, and they are relevant for each age group. This was one of the building blocks. The other one was how to work with distressed children and distressed caregivers so that you do not harm. And the third building block was about managing stress in professionals. So we really paid a lot of attention how we can take care of professionals. And you can see there are many topics addressed there, from more theoretical to more practical, but it has been all adapted to the early years, because we need to understand what means a toddler in distress, what means a 2 years old in distress, what means a 5 years old in distress, and how do we understand that type of behavior so that we don't over-pathologize, but we intervene in the way that we build that resilience. And I have to say, because of the very specific age, we're talking about play having a huge healing role. So how do we actually valorize all the knowledge and the practice that practitioners already have, but only change a bit their perspective on how they could be more careful on certain aspects that are very visible when we talk about distressed children. Next slide. And we noticed, because we have been in contact with trainers and practitioners, it is really overwhelming and it's very stressful for them. Also having the pressure of wanting to do so much, but not being very sure that they are doing the right thing. And that puts a lot of pressure. So if we don't really also support them in learning how they can take care of themselves and how they can prevent the stress, then we can do even more harm by not supporting them. So taking care of professionals has been very important. And I have to say that in the training, they have highly appreciated this part of the training, because nobody talks about their well-being, about the joy of being an early childhood professional. Next slide. And what did we learn from the practitioners? First of all, so what we have done, we managed to train 119 master trainers. And this has happened in 21 countries. You have some of the countries mentioned there. And the trainers came from different sectors. So that's how we start kind of sewing that kind of connective tissue across professions. When you do trainings together with not only one category of professional early childhood educators, or only with social workers, or only with health workers. When you start doing such trainings with people that are belonging to different sectors, and they start having the belonging to a professional identity in the early years, that's also making a great contribution to the whole thinking about integrated system. Because that's where the integration actually happens, right? It has to happen in practice. It has to happen at the level of the services. We train more than, those trainers have trained more than 1,000 professionals so far that are coming from frontline workers, or in all those countries. And that the work doesn't stop here, so it's continuing. But we've planted some seeds that we think that they will grow over the years. But it was very important that we plan to bring to professionals from different fields, even professionals that are working in non-governmental organizations. So it's not just for those that are working only directly with the children and parents, but also for those that are shaping up programs. Yes, they are creating initiatives, or they are working with services and initiating such type of programs. Next slide, please. So what we have learned is that although trauma is part of life, so the COVID has just flagged it perhaps even more, and as the war in Ukraine, but it has been in our lives forever, I have to say. And for a child, for example, having their dog dying, or some member of the family. These are traumatic events that we perhaps sometimes are considering not that important, but they are. And there are many of such experiences that could be traumatic for children, but we don't need to over pathologize the trauma, but these are pieces, drops that are coming, and if they are not properly addressed, then they can become more serious problems. It's also not just about early childhood education and care professionals, it's about all professionals that are working with children and families, so across all the sectors. And when working with distressed children and their caregivers, this can be very overwhelming, as we said, and the mental health of professionals has to be equally considered as a priority. It's very important in all these trainings that there is a very high combination of theory and practice, because professionals need to understand how many of the concepts that are out there can be translated. What does that mean for me? So how do I recognize distress in children, and what do I do after recognizing it? What we have also noticed, because of the high demand and the fact that professionals were quite new to many of the concepts and content that has been in the training, that the topics related to trauma-informed approaches and building resilience are not mainstream, either in pre-service or in-service training. So even if there is a need there, there's no place where they can really learn about unless they would do it themselves. Next slide. And what we have learned from practitioners, I think it's also equally important by having participated in this training, is that the training has had a transformative power for them both personally and professionally. And that's very important, because no professional can divide itself from their personal identity and personal features. So we have helped them as human beings, and we have helped them as professionals in understanding how they can cope with challenging situations so that they can best cope with challenges that children and families face. Another real breakthrough of those who were trained was that the training transformed the way that they prioritize their task. They set boundaries, and they self-regulate and prevent their own stress. It was so important for them to understand how far their contribution or their responsibility goes, and not feel guilty or not feel a lot of pressure that they do not do more, because there are other professionals that they can refer to. And that was one of the basic principles in the psychological first aid. You look, you listen, you act, but if you can't, you link with another professional. And that was very important for them to understand, to be aware of, to understand, and to see that they don't need to do everything, that there is a limit to what their responsibility is covering. And the other important thing that they have noticed, it was the importance of destigmatization, the mental health issues, and giving it equal value as the physical health and educational achievement. So it's equally important to have a good mental health. It's not an issue of having, of being stigmatized because of having potentially issues, mental health issues. And the last thing that I will close not with a Freire quote, but with quotes from practitioners, from trainers, which I think are equally important in this discussion. I mean, I think that I very much agree with what Matthias said with the words of Freire. We do need system changes, but we also need people that are working in those systems to be supported and help them change. And you can't help them just by having top-down policies. Sometimes there are some of the things that can start from the bottom up and have build that kind of competence and confidence that they can address many of the issues. And I just chose some of the quotes that came from the trainers in Ukraine and one in Romania. The trainers saying that we can see that after receiving the training, preschool teachers became more confident in their actions. They are not afraid to make decisions. They know how to calm down children and parents. Children also became less anxious, and their parents became more aware of their needs and reactions and started to consult with educator, which was not observed for many years. And the other trainer in Romania said practitioners felt more confident and can act more effectively and timely to support refugee children and families in integrating into the new environment. They can more easily recognize signs of distress and trauma, identify the needs of children and families, and create a climate of safety and support. And I think that's what we actually have aimed for. And I think that's from where also the change can become. They can be more aware of what their role and how their contribution as professional into a system that should function as an ecosystem can be done. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Michaela. Thank you, Matthias. Thank you, Mr. Breglitz. Now, I would like to, before open the debate with all the participants here and online, I would like to ask you if there are some questions that you want to ask to the speaker and to Ms. Breglitz that we can still have for a few more minutes with us. So please, if you have any questions, now it's your turn and your moment. Online also, if there are some questions. Go ahead, Johanna. Could you tell your name and your organization?
Yes, Johanna Shima from Make Mothers Matter. It's not really a question, but it's a topic that I think we are still failing families. I mean, sorry for putting another gloomy fact here on the table, but they help us to go into the gloominess. We are not taking into account maternal health, the physical and the mental health of the mother, because it's not only this, the beginning doesn't start when the child is small and alive, but it starts within the pregnancy period. So I think that the policies are not addressing this issue. We all know from research, different researchers, that the mental health, especially, and the physical, of course, of the mother is linked with the mental health of the child, and starting from the pregnancy period and going through more than beyond the 1,000 years of age. We know also that 1 out of 5 women worldwide would suffer from a mental health condition during the pregnancy, and that these mental health issues are transmitted to the child and even transmitted through generations to come. So it's not only the child in himself, but it's the generation after this child and more. So knowing this, and there is one fact that is very, we are talking here about trauma and about support, family support, which is very important, I think, but also it's been a study and research that when we are talking about child poverty, is not are not the conditions of poverty themselves, the economic bad and low conditions of the child that are affecting this child, but it's the internalization and the emotions linked to this poverty that the mother feels during this, either the pregnancy or the first years of life of the child, that are passed on the child. So this is very strong information that we have. It's been studied, it's been researched. So my call here to this table and to researchers and policymakers, of course, is to include maternal health, both physical and mental, into the child. If we want to bring the well-being of children and make them advance, we need to start from the very beginning. So that's the gloomy fact, but I think there are things to be done.
Thank you, Joanna. Someone here from the panel wants to react on what Joanna just stated.
I mean, I could just have a quick reaction because we, ISA, together with Eurochild and a few other organizations, are leading a campaign on early childhood development, first years first priority, and one of the thematic paper actually focused on maternal health. Because we are promoting the holistic understanding of early childhood development, but also policies that are impacting child development. And it's very much linked with what Matthias actually has talked about. How can we have a comprehensive understanding of all the policies that are impacting the child development since conception? And that includes also the period before birth, and that includes the everything that regards families that are to become parents. Yes. And I think that's the part that we are missing very much. In general, the focus on early years and starting from conception. And we talk about, I have to recognize that there has been a quite child-friendly, I would say, leadership in the past years at the European level regarding childhood. Yes, so we have a strategy on the child's rights, we have the child guarantee, there is Barcelona target. So there is a focus, growing focus, I would say. There is the intergroup on children's rights. So there is an interest and concern for childhood, but childhood is from conception to 18 years old. And we are afraid that the youngest ones, where the foundations are laid, are not properly, are not visible enough in the policies or given the priority that they would deserve, because of the biggest advantages that we would have if we would address all their needs at that age and their parents, because at that age we can't talk about children without talking about parents. So the campaign is really promoting that, and the thematic papers we have issued, it was about recommendations that we have at the European level, but at the country level too, on how we can really consider drawing up a strategy that looks at the child holistically across policies and across services.
Actually, this topic is also part of our report. It is addressed on two issues. On one is sexual and reproductive health and rights, which is something which the right spectrum is always fighting against. And other is integrated services for mothers. This is the thing. And, you know, mostly things are sometimes, unfortunately, not taken practically, but are taken ideologically, and how you see family, mothers with the support of the society and services available, or just reducing everything to the families. And this means putting a woman in disadvantaged position totally, and this will just, you know, prolong the issues. But yeah, also those fights are going on whenever we are voting in the parliament. Whenever we are mentioning sexual health and rights, it is immediately, you know, the question of abortion and all those issues. But this is whole, you know, whole spectrum. And yeah, we have sometimes fights also within the parliament to really prioritize the issues which are the most important. And as you mentioned, yeah, mothers are necessary, but also generations through that. And families are definitely connected with that. As you mentioned joy before, I will mention love also in any kinds of.
Thank you. Matthias, you want to reply here too?
Yeah, just very briefly, because I think this is, you made a very important point. And when we look at the successful examples of integrated services, and one of the big successes, for instance, of the English Sure Start Children's Centres programs was that it started with a prenatal support for young mothers, and then moving into what one of the founders of the first centers used to say all the time is all the services need to be in what she called pram pushing distance in terms of how things are accessible. But when we look at successful examples across Europe, across South America, across India, the prenatal support is really where things start.
Thank you, Matthias. There is a question online, and then I will give you again the floor here in presence of one. Okay, it's Tom.
That's right. Can you sorry? Can you hear me or in the room?
Yes, we can hear you so well. Thank you, Tom.
Okay. And apologies for not being there in person. I would have liked to come, but unfortunately I still have some cold symptoms. So otherwise I would have been there. Yeah, thanks very much. That discussion that you just had also very important. I think I just wanted to also underline that the maternal health question is really important. And also from a gender equity perspective, of course, like the disproportionate care burden on women, for example. So really glad to have had that discussion take place in the room. What I wanted to ask the panelists, and this is a question that is very often asked because it relates to political will. Because of course we have, for example, Milan Berglas in the room. There was a great ally to us when it comes to early childhood development. But at the same time, we also have to face the reality that after the next European elections, we might be faced with a completely different political situation. And I was wondering how the panelists look at that, because as we talked about today, there's a lot of things that we need to act on when it comes to early childhood development, trauma-informed care. Talking about the specific political or policy instruments that are in place, the European Care Strategy comes to mind now as something that is very important to this topic. But at the same time, these are instruments that are not necessarily legally binding, that do not necessarily force member states to act on these topics. And with that changed political situation in mind, I'm just wondering how the panelists perceive that, how they believe we can actually also generate political will to start doing this, because currently we at least cannot fully rely on the policy instruments that are in place.
Thank you, Tom. So,
Yeah, I will try to answer. Yeah, nothing is guaranteed actually, because of in the next elections, everything which we have already, we have to renew, even at the organizational level. I would say on one side. The other side, which is also perhaps hidden, is something which is, I would say, no politician will publicly admit that is against children or against someone, but they will do everything possible that things will not come to the agenda. And this is even the liberal mantra. I'm not saying just right side, but also within liberal circles, this is the case at the national level, at the European level. I have the experience on both levels of the parliament, and I know how things are. Sometimes, there is a lot of fight behind actually that things are coming to the agenda. When it comes, yeah, it's okay, but it is also, then is the question of what you will do to assure that actually, the topics will not be actually just put it under the carpet at the national level. Because care without pandemic, at the European level, we will never discuss care. Okay, this was reduction on the one side, this is reduction of demographic question. But okay, this is very important. It is okay, gender-related issue on all sides. Even the rightists would admit that this is clearly gender issue. But nevertheless, we needed huge initiative actually to do it. And where we actually ended up was just 2 council recommendations connected with the care strategy. Where, okay, it's important to have a strategy. We have no strategy for older persons, for instance, and intergenerational solidarity. We do not have it. Huh? But here actually we at least have that, and we have to base and put additional layers on that. One possibility would be a kind of minimum standards of care, if you like. It also all kind of care, but actually what we have also the problem is not just children, but it starts with children, also with long-time care, because those things are totally interconnected, and everything in between. And we will need something like child, like on the example of child guarantee, we can have something like a care guarantee also, at least in crisis to the affordability is the problem, this and to use also money where politics is talking about. So as long politicians are just talking and adopting resolutions without putting money also on that, they are not serious. What I found it also in your presentation, this dedicated budget to the body. This is huge, but this is really a revolution compared to what things are going now. And to put pressure on it, this is, I think, very, very, very much, something. Or to have, as I said before, let's say minimum standards, or have some legislative measures also. It is possible now, when it is finally at least recognized that this is not just national competence, but that this is common problem. It goes, let's say, now we have even the, on the request of the council, actually Commission provided even the toolbox for care, based, because of the council recommendation, on the question of the competition. How to build European competition, and not on the question of the rights, and in particular not children's rights, which should be behind. So, despite we know that nothing can function without essential workers during the crisis, but also outside of the crisis, we are still behaving in the same way as before, just looking for another business opportunity, I would say.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There is a question here in the room, and then another one in the chat. So I will give the floor to Dominic for his questions, and then to Aria from the online.
Thank you. So my name is Dominic Richardson, and I work for the Learning for Wellbeing Institute. I used to work for the OECD, and some years ago, 2007, we published Doing Better for Children, and in it had a chapter called From Conception to Kindergarten. And we've known for at least 2 decades the importance of getting the period from conception through to birth right. And as it stands, most European countries only provide for a few weeks of maternity leave. And these are often only available to women in work. Whereas we should be focusing on, if for holistic child policies, we should really be focusing on prenatal cash benefits to reduce the stresses on families, whether they're working or not. And my guess is those not in work probably have more stresses than those who are, and are probably in more need of the supports. We've just published a study with Columbia University on this subject, on prenatal payments. 6 European countries are paying prenatal cash benefits. And most interesting ones perhaps are Sweden with a pregnancy cash transfer, and Italy's brand new child benefit, when I say brand new, from 2021, actually starts paying its child allowance at the 7th month of birth. It's interesting to note that the countries that do have child birth grants pay them when the child is born, a point at which no parent is quite ready to invest that money, particularly if you're poor. Why we don't spend them like the French do and pay on the 6th month of pregnancy so parents can prepare the house for the child, I don't know. But I do think it's indicative of our lack of understanding of family functioning in our public policies for children. That's an aside. Europe still spends less on its children from conception to 6 than it does at any other stage in the child life course. It should be a third if we were going to spend equally. It's about 27%. If you're in a poor country, the poorest in the world, it's only 6% that goes on the under 6s. Of course, that's not going to lead us to the human and social development we want to see. And it's not going to be able to do all of these wonderful integrated plans that we have. So my question at the end of all of that is, what can Europe do to increase the spending and at least reach parity for children under 6? And what can it do through its foreign assistance? Last year, the US government asked USAID to report its spending on children by age in the $60 billion it spends every year. What can Europe tell us about what the European euro does for parity for the under sixes globally? Thanks.
Thank you, Dominic. Someone wants to reply on the question?
Problem, as always politically, it is that the EU, there is no competence. This is national competence, and this is again, you need such a, the only competence we has been able to somehow receive or has been given because of the urgency of care, because we found because of the pandemic that this is totally dysfunctional, but it's absolutely necessary. And so far, as long it goes under that carpet, something can be probably done. But we need to stick and to repeat the adopted position, at least, when Parliament has adopted a position, to stick to what we have. But we have always the fight, even for child benefit or additional 20 billion. This is the fight always in each resolution, should it goes through or not, and either at the level of the committee or either at the level of the plenary. This is always so keep repeating what was already adopted and trying to build and try to actually put those issues also on the semester and budgeting. This will actually, if this is the indirect way how to force states that they are spending for proper purposes, and this is definitely proper purpose. I've, let's say, looked at the Roma children. Most of them, they are not even integrated in the kindergartens, and without spending there, how to have inclusion, how to have integration into the system. No way, without really doing this first most important thing for anything later on. Whatever you will spend later, it is probably too late if there is no foundation on which you can build.
Thank you. I leave Matthias, then Arya, and then we close the session of the questions.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I would be actually a bit more hopeful there in terms of Europe. When it comes to the field of early childhood education and care, the sort of formal pre-primary settings, European policy has been hugely influential on member state level. Things like when all the policy developments that have come out of Europe since the early 90s, the first Council recommendation, the European Quality Framework for Early Child Education and Care is a benchmark now at member state level. So what happens in Europe can be influential. So that makes me hopeful. The second thing, and this is in relation to your example to say Europe had to do something about care after the pandemic. We are increasingly aware, and it's been mentioned in the introduction, in our presentations, and in that we are facing a global crisis scenario at an unprecedented scale. What we know from the pandemic experience is that countries that have a more integrated early childhood system, not just services, but the entire system, integration between policy silos, integration with an integrated data system where the health management information systems and the education management information systems actually talk to each other. Those countries seem to have coped with the disruption by the pandemic in a better way than countries that did not have these systems. Many of these countries are outside the European Union, again, so we need to learn, we need to look over the fence and actually learn with those. But there is an argument that if we say that early childhood is an integral part of making social societies resilient, creating social coherence, which is something that the G20, for instance, is very strongly cares about, then there is an argument to say We need to lead by example. We need to set policies that encourage member states to move much quicker into the direction of highly integrated, multi-sectoral early childhood systems.
Thank you. Last question from Arya. And Lea, if you can, so we can read after what is written in the chat. Please, Arya.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I was following with great interest what has been said by the different speakers, and I think one of the fundamental problems that we have, not only with early childhood, not only with care, is with education, is the fact that, and it has been mentioned, and it's visible in the wording that we are using. We have been talking about spending money. Yeah, we're talking about expenses. Actually, these need to be seen as investments. And I think this is one of the fundamental points how we can maybe also change the discourse on the European level. We need to talk to the economists and the people who are in charge of finances. If we can change that discourse and make them see that this is an investment, like any other investment that they do in order to prevent certain things from happening, like banks going bankrupt or whatever during times of crisis, then I think we have a better chance of getting actually the funding that is needed. Now, I really think that, and it was mentioned also today, that the early childhood, of course, is the foundation on which everything else is built. And it's like building a house. If you don't build your foundation well, you risk that the whole house will collapse in the end. So if we can make people understand how important this is for the future of not only the society, but also the economy, yeah? And we are facing in most countries a shortage of teachers, shortage of professional workers, skilled workers. So maybe by mentioning these factors, we could turn the tables around. Thank you.
Thank you, Arya. And by reading what, if someone wants to reply to Arya, otherwise you, okay. Yes, please. No, please, we are happy now on your reply. And yes.
This is, something which is actually going on. We are trying at the presidency level. Belgian presidency will try actually to using big council where the ECOFIN ministers and ministers of labor and social affairs will meet to turn the narrative into what kind of social investment should be exemption from the budgetary cuts. And this is a huge, this is the battle. This is something, when you would say to economists or to my friends in the parliament in other committees for trade and other roles, that this is, that not just these rights we are speaking about, but that this is investment. Okay, they can take this neoliberal understanding and put it also in the policy. This is something which you can make within the discourse which is prevailing. Because just saying that this is human right is not enough. It is really not enough. You have to have the and to exempt that from the budgetary cuts is probably the most important. That in addition to spending for all those things which always come before children, you can spend also for children without being punished. For doing that from the Commission, like in previous financial crisis, where everything was connected with austerity. So at least now we are not speaking, or at least at the first moment we are not speaking about austerity. But in the second thought, austerity is always somewhere behind. So exempt that with this understanding, yes, definitely.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your availability to reply to every questions. We are happy. I know, and we appreciate the fact that you can stay for all the event. I would like to close this session of questions with what Dr. Russell Harn from EMDR, that is member also of the Alliance for Childhood, wrote in the chat. I'm so pleased to see we are considering the integration of services to build a strong and supportive community in which children can grow and develop and overcome traumatic experiences. It is the community society response as a unified force that will help our young people become resilient, resourced, and productive adults who can also support the following generation. Education, training, and support for the caring adults is needed so much. Thank you, Russell, for what you wrote. And this brings me also to the almost close the session because we are almost over our timing for this event with the link that I could do with what just wrote from Russell's on one statement that also the lifelong learning platforms launched and published on early child education and care that is called Children's as First Lifelong Learning lifelong learners that it's actually recommends. So basically what we have heard from panelists and from participants, increasing paternity and maternity leaves, increasing investment, looking at early child education and care as key moment to build a new, a better society, because everything starts from that moment and even before our birth, before coming in this world. And I want also close this, and then I'll give the floor for the closing remarks to Christopher, with also all of you have received also the statement that the Alliance for Childhood launched last in the last QoC about the mental health, how to tackle mental health in for children. And I would like to close with the recommendation that we as Alliance for Childhood define it for, so just the recommendation exactly. So addressing mental health needs of children and youth through trauma-informed services, early and accessible support, reduced stigmatism and integrated policies. And we are happy that everything is that being said and taken also on the policy side. And then comprehensive approach to mental health crisis involves slide please, involves young people in treatment and service design, data collection agencies get support to collect and share comparable data for all children, and education and policies include mental health as pedagogical outcome. You can find the statement in the folder that you have received. We will share with Mr. Breglet as well this statement. And then I would like to give the floor to Christopher for just closing and the last words. There are still less than 15 minutes. So I would like to hear from you also your reaction and your point of view about. Thank you.
What we've heard today is almost encyclopedic. It's a vast field when we start really thinking about care for our children, for the next generation and future generations. And looking at what's been presented today, the work seems so vast that we have to accommodate to bring about this change in human mentality, in cultural understanding, in pedagogical impulses, on inspiration, courage, and the forces of love. How do we encapsulate that in a few words? How do we put that in a few words? And that's the task we've set ourselves as the Alliance, to somehow bring all this together like a little crystal that we can show as supportive for your work, which is so precious in the European Parliament. So what we're looking for is trying to put all this together in just a few sentences. This has been magnificent, what you presented, our two speakers. Vast field of endeavour and care. But where do we bring it in a way that's just people are able to stand with and stand by? including questions we've had later today. So I don't know if anybody's got any sort of thoughts of how one could encapsulate today's process into a few words. A difficult task always, but something that would stand by you and others, that civil society wants to take action in all our various NGOs and individuals that are here today. Oh, sorry.
No, just so that
Okay.
the camera can.
Any ideas? Dominic.
I don't think we go far wrong by starting with a recommendation or a principle to be true to the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child, and particularly every child's right to social protection, which is the main vehicle for delivering on the cash supports prenatal and the social and human services in the immediate postnatal period. Europe's done a lot to expand childcare over the past 15 years, and we need now social protection in the early years to catch up, and very much appreciate the comment about progressive universalism. That is both true to the rights of the child, also true to the social investment principles, and essentially wouldn't amount to a major change in the financial costs, given the expense of means-tested benefits, which continue in maybe a third of European countries.
Thank you, Dominic. And I think actually Article 24 of the Convention says every child has the right to the best possible mental health. Yeah. But as Mr. Berglitz has pointed out, appealing to the rights issue is not always very conducive to change. Just another thought, we're coming to Christmas. And whatever sort of religion stands behind it, this is very interesting that in the middle of winter, we focus, or at least in a religious Christian sense, there's that focus on the child. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity to take that quality of childhood, yeah, that we stand for in this group, in this network, taking that quality of childhood, what children bring to us. Well, I forgot to mention when I was mentioning my little granddaughter going up and down the stairs on her hands and knees, the joy that she encapsulated, I felt. It was my joy too. It wasn't just her pleasure in discovering what her body could do and keep repeating. It's something that was contagious. That joyfulness of childhood is contagious. And then she invented the little game. And sort of in that relationship, she knew I was following her up and down, so in case she fall down, I was always there, worried. So at the top of the staircase, she did a little pirouette, so I wouldn't know if she was going to go down or further up. So straight away after that, she'd invented a little play, the game, the playfulness. And I think that's something we have to bring to our work too, to bring together as adults this quality of wonder, of love, of trust, and that playfulness that brings the joy. And somehow it's all so serious, all our perma-crisis, going on around us in this adult world of ours, which of course also infects all children in many different ways. It goes down to them whether we know it or not. But how can we somehow bring that childhood quality in ourselves, we still have, to redeem the situation? It's not just a matter of politics or diplomacy or all these things we think are just from the heart. And in our hearts, we still have our childhood. And I think in a way that if we can really find ways of, how can I put it, lifting ourselves up, allowing the children to lift us up, and our own childhood, then perhaps we can find ways to make a better childhood for other children, yeah, across the world. So it's just that thought I had as coming towards Christmas. When we take that focus to the birth of a child, that we can bring it into something more in our own actions, in our own hearts, and our own common humanity that we all share, and find that child in us, not just there to serve, to look after, to care for, but caring for what's remains of our childhood in ourselves. And I think in that way, then we can discover a world that isn't fragmented, isn't pulled apart, whether it's religion, history, gender, whatever, that we find that common humanity that we can share as a Christmas thought to enable us to serve the future. But that's not a statement, that's just me thinking of things.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Breglis, what would you like us to do?
I would like that you're continuing bringing the issue and the pressure from the civil society. You know, you have to do it at the national level, at the local level, but also the European level. This is the major task, and to connect all dots of all of you working actually for different alliances, associations, to really, because as I said, if you can put things on the agenda, even if things will come in wrong side for Europe and other things, or you know, because you never know from the elections to the elections if things will continue in the right way. But your pressure it will be probably essential, and on the other side, essential also to prevent that things are going too much wrong.
Okay, after this final speech and having said and mentioned joy and love, I think that we can happily close this session with a lot of hope and loves and joy. I would like to thank you so much, Mr. Breglitz, to stay for all the event. Also Stasa, that was always available in replying our requests, setting the recording, and etc. I would like to thank you all the participants that were so active and focused on the topic. Also those online, that also of them staying 2 hours online. It's not easy, but you did it. Thank you. And of course, thanks to the speaker, Matthias and Michaela, that I didn't mention before, but both are part of the working group of the European Commission on Early Child Education and Care. So we have had the chance to have also a fresh and good insight from that. So thank you all, and I'm looking forward to see you again in our next QoC. And also, Mr. Breglitz, in case you want to join the next one, but you will be updated about. For those who have subscribed, also registered for the post-QoC, we are going all together to the Alliance for Child office, where we offer easy lunch sandwiches just to refresh and continue chatting in a formal way on what we have heard so far. So thank you so much to all, and I wish you a very nice day, even it's raining, but still with joy and love. Thank you.